much fun about tomatoes, if anything. I mean, they're delicious. They're important. They're a dominant vegetable that nobody could live without. It took a Supreme Court decision to determine they were a vegetable, not a fruit, about 40 years ago. But let me try find some things to tell you about tomatoes that are fun. In the ongoing adventures of plant taxonomy, the DNA data is changing the way we look at plants, and so the names of the plants are forever changing, so that we would have said Lycopersicum for the last 50 or 100 years, but now we're saying Solanum. And one of the interesting things about that is Solanum is this wonderful big family. Potatoes are Solanum in the genus Solanum. Eggplants in the genus Solanum, and there are a bunch of deadly nightshade is a Solanum. Okay, so there's about almost 2,000 species in this. And the idea was, back when it had its own genus, it was different. You know, tomatoes are special. They're different. We won't just lump them in. But the DNA data said, no, they're not that special. They're neat, but they're not special. And so they became part of Solanum, just as potatoes are also Solanum. They're native to Peru. But I think when people say they're native to Peru, everybody imagines that they're up there with the Inca. And actually, just as you know from the fact that tomatoes can't take a frost, that we always plant them up in the beginning of the indoors and get them this big before putting them outside because our growing season is too short. And sometimes you still don't get very many tomatoes before frost gets them. Our growing season is too short for them. They like many more days of nice temperatures. They like it warm and wet. Yeah, they're from Peru, but they're from Amazonian Peru. They're from the edges of the Amazon basin and the rainforest where it's warm and wet. And so they started off in Peru, but the Incas never used them, or almost never. And they were domesticated in Mexico. And the biologists do this little piece of hand waving that I can't top, but I don't like. It says, oh, birds probably took them to Mexico. Maybe. It's possible a bird ate a tomato, the little bitty ones that were wild, you know, and flew to Mexico and dropped them in the fields of the Maya where they grew up as weeds. How they got there, maybe there's a better story. But the truth is, they first appear as weeds in the tomatillo fields. The Maya and the Aztecs before them grew a Solanum as a major crop plant, but it wasn't tomatoes. It was tomatillos, what we call tomatillos. The guys in the little paper covering. And apparently, tomatoes showed up there, and so by the time Cortez arrived, the Mexicans, the Maya and the Aztec were growing several kinds of tomatoes. But it started off as a crop weed. Why did the tomato go out with a prune? Because he couldn't find a date. Okay? Matching your tomato with another fruit, vegetable, goes back to that domestication period, okay? The Aztecs and the Mayas were not particularly interested in tomatoes for themselves, but they were nice with chili peppers. Okay, so if your chili sauce was too strong, add a couple of tomatoes. If you wanted to shift the color, add a couple of tomatoes. They were companion plants. I guess if we were interviewing tomatoes, they'd say, boy, have we come a long way. And they went from Cortez and the Mexicans across the world almost immediately, but people didn't necessarily start eating them. In fact, there was a fair amount of resistance. Part of it was, in Europe, a problem with names. Tomatoes were new. There were no solanum fruits that the people were used to eating at all. And so they didn't have a name for them. And they confused them with eggplant, which was apparently just being brought in or just come in. Was still a we've never seen this before. What do we do with it? Solanum, about the same time. So they called it in Spain Pomme de Mori, apple of the Moors. Okay, this is something because the eggplant came with the Moors out of Africa, because it's originated in Asia. And the tomato shows up just about the same time, at least in the popular feeling. And they go, oh yeah, what is this one? I don't know. This must be that apple of the Moors. Which, in French, turned into pomme de mort, love apple, because it sounds like the same word, doesn't it? And in Italy, turned into pomodoro, which is golden apple. And so you can read, in Wikipedia in fact, that the earliest tomatoes were yellow. No. That's this translation going, oh, it must be yellow because they called it golden in Italy. So, and the Spaniards and then the Italians, you have to remember in the 1500s, Italy was part of the Holy Roman Empire, where most of it was, and the head of the Holy Roman Empire was a Spanish king. So it was all one great big unhappy family that fell apart very quickly thereafter. But for a short period of time, the things that came into the New World could go quickly to Italy. And tomatoes, of course, would grow well there. Their growing season is long. You add enough water, they do well. So the Spaniards quickly turned them into their sauces. And the Italians followed soon, although the history of food writers are careful to say, Italian food is not uniform. Not all parts of Italy have even yet started putting tomatoes all over everything, but some places certainly do. And where they were not accepted in the north, probably because of that short growing season, but the writers also suggest that we've all had mediocre tomatoes. So apparently we've had good tomatoes to make it worth our sticking it out to find through all those mediocre tomatoes. But in, say, England and northern France, the tomatoes you got would be tomato after tomato, quite mediocre, unless they knew what they were doing growing them. And so that's probably some of the resistance. The same was true in the United States. So it was the late 1800s into the 20th century that before England and the United States ate tomatoes. And that's the usual story, which is kind of fun, but it's not true in the South and the West. Tomatoes came in out of Mexico. They came into Arizona by 1700. They came into New Mexico about the same time, the 1600s. They were raised in the missions in Mexico, in Texas, while Texas was independent. So it depends on who your tradition is, when tomatoes came in and when they were surprised. So I will end with that, saying tomatoes, of course, today are incredibly complicated. They're a major food. They're produced, actually China is the biggest producer of tomatoes in the world, and have been adapted. When I say that, then I can say, well, look, they were adapted in the United States, and they were adapted in China, and they are all over the world as a major ingredient. And I guess if we're quoting tomatoes, they're a big success. No longer, who's ever heard of tomatillo? So, thank you. I'm Kathy Keeler, traveling the world far and wide to find great plant stories and to bring them back to you, because I am a wandering botanist.